Chapter 2. Getting Along, Getting Ahead. If Ben can thrive in prison, we can hope to thrive too. There can't be many of us who find ourselves as lacking in agency and opportunity as he did. How easy it should be. Open the door, step out of it, and there it is, the world in all its hustle and wonder. The story we're often told is that with sufficient application of self-belief and effort, we can do anything we want, be whoever we want. But it's not so easy. The world isn't as it seems. On the other side of that door, you won't find a simple pathway to happiness that you can march up heroically for 7 or 8 decades. Everyone out there is playing a game. That game has its own hidden rules, traps and shortcuts. And yet almost nobody alive is fully conscious of its form, despite being active daily participants. So let's attempt to wake ourselves up to the great game. Let's try to define more precisely what human life is and what it's trying to be. Humans are a species of great ape. We survive by belonging to highly cooperative groups that share labour. We've been living in settled communities for around 500 generations. But we existed in mobile hunter-gatherer bands for far longer than this, at least 100,000 generations. Our brains remain programmed for this style of life. We are today as we've always been, tribal. We have instincts that compel us to seek connection with coalitions of others. Once we've been accepted into a group, we strive to achieve their approval and acclaim. If we're to flourish, this approval and acclaim is critical. Researchers find that in the kinds of pre-modern communities our brains evolved in, social status is a universal cue to the control of resources, writes psychologist Professor David Buss. Along with status comes better food, more abundant territory, superior healthcare. It leads to greater access to preferred mates and bestows on children social opportunities that youngsters in lower-ranking families miss out on. When researchers analysed 186 pre-modern societies around the world, they found men of higher status invariably had greater wealth and more wives and provided better nourishment for their children. This was, and remains, the secret of maximising our capacity for survival and reproduction. The higher we rise, the more likely we are to live, love and procreate. It's the essence of human thriving. It's the status game. Evolution has programmed us to seek groups to join and then strive for rank within them. But, especially in the modern era, we're not limited to one group. For those of us not in prison, a typical life involves the playing of multiple games. Wherever we connect with like-minded others, the game will be on. At work, online, on the sports field, at the volunteer centre, in the club, park or activist collective, even at home. The minimum requirement for play is connection. Before we can be rewarded with status, we must first be accepted into the group as a player. Psychologists find that simply connecting with others and feeling accepted by them can be profoundly good for us. But equally revealing is how our minds and bodies react when we fail to connect. A wide range of research finds people with depression tend to belong to far fewer groups than the rest of the population. Studies across time suggest the more a depressed person identifies with their group, the more of their own sense of self they invest in it, the more their symptoms lift. Failure to connect can even make us physically ill. Numerous studies find it's possible to predict mortality by observing the extent to which someone has meaningful contact with others. One survey of nearly 7,000 residents of Alameda County in California found the people most likely to survive to old age were those with solid face-to-face relationships, writes psychologist Susan Pinker. Their social relationships, or lack of them, predicted mortality independently of how healthy, well-to-do or physically fit they were. Disconnection is a fearsome state for a social animal to find itself in. It's a warning that its life is failing and its world has become hostile. Where there's no connection, there's no protection. Isolation damages us so profoundly it can change who we are. It can force us into a defensive crouch, writes psychologist Professor John Cacioppo, in which we seek to fend off the threat of further rejection. our perceptions of other people become warped. They start to appear more critical, competitive, denigrating, or otherwise unwelcoming. These faulty interpretations quickly become expectations. We can become scrappy, bitter, and negative, a mindset that leads to greater marital strife, more run-ins with neighbours, and more social problems overall. When this happens, we can become even more isolated and vulnerable to yet further varieties of antisocial behaviour. Rejected people are more likely to issue punishments and less likely to donate money or help strangers. They can engage in self-damaging habits. In one study, participants were told they were taste testing chocolate chip cookies. Before the test began, they were asked to mingle with other tasters, then choose 2 they'd like to work with. Some were told, falsely, that nobody had picked them. Others that everyone had. The first group, who'd been socially rejected, went on to eat an average of 9 cookies more than the non-rejected, nearly twice the number. Most of them even rated the taste of the cookies more highly, implying their rejection actually altered their perceptions of the sugary food. When our lives begin to fail then, our minds and bodies fail too. We can become sick, angry, antisocial, and increasingly isolated. We are, writes Cacioppo, creatures shaped by evolution to feel safe in company and endangered when unwillingly alone. But connection itself doesn't make for a successful life. We're rarely content to linger on the lowest social rungs of our groups, likeable but useless. We desire worth, acclaim, to be of value. There's an itch to move up. In the oft-quoted words of psychologist Professor Robert Hogan, humans are driven to get along and get ahead. Or, from the perspective of our current investigation, to be accepted into status games and to play well. If rejection from the game can make us sad, angry and sick, the effects of failing to win status can be deadly. The epidemiologist Dr. Michael Marmot has exposed the extraordinary power the status game has over our physical well-being. He spent decades analysing the health of members of the British Civil Service. Britain was and is a stratified society, he writes, and no part of it is more exquisitely stratified. This made it an ideal laboratory in which to discover how subtle differences in social ranking can lead to dramatic differences in health in people who are neither very poor nor very rich. Marmot was surprised to discover precisely how high a civil servant climbed in the game of the civil service predicted their health outcomes and mortality rates. This was not, as you might reasonably assume, to do with the wealthier individuals leading healthier and more privileged lifestyles. This effect, which Marmot calls the status syndrome, was entirely independent. A wealthy smoker, just one rung below the very top of the status game, was more likely to fall ill as a result of their habit than the smoker one rung above them. And these health differentials were extremely significant. Workers at the bottom of the office hierarchy have, at ages 40 to 64, 4 times the risk of death of the administrators at the top of the hierarchy. This remained true with every step you took up or down the game. The lower you dropped, the worse your health and the earlier your death. The group second from the top has higher mortality than those above them in the ranking. These remarkable and telling findings have been confirmed in men and in women. They've even been found in baboons. In the lab, monkeys were fed diets high in cholesterol and fat until they developed dangerous levels of atherosclerotic plaque. The higher the monkey was in their troop's status hierarchy, the less likely they were to fall ill as a result of their nasty diets. When researchers conspired to alter the hierarchy, each monkey's risk of illness changed in lockstep with their change in status. It was the new position, not the one they started with, that determined the degree of atherosclerosis they developed, writes Marmot, and the differences were dramatic. Tentative clues as to how this might happen come from the new science of social genomics, which examines how our social worlds affect our genes and the ways they function. The basic idea is that when we're not doing well in the game of life, our bodies prepare for crisis by switching our settings so we're readied for attack. It increases inflammation, which helps the healing of any physical wounds we might be about to suffer. It also saves resources by reducing our antiviral response. But when our inflammation is raised for too long, it can damage us in myriad ways. It increases susceptibility to neurodegenerative disease, promotes the spread of plaque in the arteries and the growth of cancer cells. According to a world leader in this field, Professor Steve Cole, several studies have related objective indicators of low social status to increased expression of pro-inflammatory genes and/or decreased expression of antiviral genes. Being beaten down in the rat race naturally changes what you expect from tomorrow, and that does seem to filter down to the way your cells prepare for tomorrow. It's probably not a surprise to discover that feeling deprived of status is a major source of anxiety and depression. When life is a game we're losing, we hurt. One review of the scientific literature found that perceiving oneself as having low rank compared to others is consistently linked to higher depressive symptoms. Some psychologists argue that when we become depressed, we mentally withdraw from the competition for higher status. This keeps us off high-status individuals' radars and conserves energy, helping us cope with the reduced opportunities imposed by low status. Frequent defeat in the status game has us scuttling off to the grey safety of the back of the cave. In the sanctuary of those shadows, our inner monologue can turn on us, becoming hypercritical in a process known as self-subordination. We talk ourselves down in an onslaught of insult, convincing ourselves the fight is useless, that we belong at the bottom, that we can only ever fail. When we're chronically deprived of status, the mind may even turn against itself and trigger its own destruction. Although the causes of suicide are many and complex, lack of status is a known common driver. Tellingly, it's sudden movements down the game that can be most dangerous. Suicide concentrates among those who experience an increase in their social inferiority and occurs mostly when people fall below others, writes sociologist Dr. Jason Manning, who adds, "The greater and faster the downward mobility, the more likely it is to trigger suicide." Those who decide to end their lives, finally quitting the game that's caused such agony, might have experienced a recent financial loss or have been made unemployed. They might have lost reputation. They might simply have stayed still whilst others have accelerated away from them. Suicide is encouraged not just by falling, but by falling behind. This game that we play is deadly serious. It's only by surveying the damage that failure can do that we begin to grasp that status isn't merely a nice sensation, like the nice sensation of clean sheets or toffee apples. We need it. Status is an essential nutrient found not in meat or fruit or sunlight, but in the successful playing of our lives. When we feel chronically deprived of it, or disconnected from the game, our minds and bodies can turn against us. To our brains, status is a resource as real as oxygen or water. When we lose it, we break.